Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar on board evaluation and development as part of the OCASI series on reimagining governance. This is a very important aspect of governance because board evaluation is probably the most effective way of improving the performance of your board as it governs the organization that you are governing. I am Diane McFarlane. I am a volunteer consultant at Management Advisory Service. Management Advisory Service itself is a volunteer nonprofit organization. It provides pro bono consulting services exclusively to the nonprofit sector. There are now about 70 volunteer consultants who have a variety of professional backgrounds, and across the entire team there is extensive knowledge and expertise and resources to be had. As I mentioned, we're pro bono. We don't charge fees for our services, and all of our volunteer consultants' time, they devote it, they contribute it, they donate it to MASS and the admin support for the organization. We've been around for about 25 years, and we like to tell people that we have worked collaboratively with over 14,000 nonprofit organizations in the GTA. More recently, that area has been extended because all our work is now being done virtually, so we can provide our service to clients who live further beyond the boundaries of the GTA. Our clients have ranged and continue to range in size from very small, for example, 2 or 3 people working out of a church basement, to major, very large, high-profile social service agencies. Myself, I have a background in both the public service and the nonprofit sector. Before I retired, which I did a few years ago, I had been the CEO of several very large organizations, as well as having executive experience, senior executive experience in the Ministry of Health in both BC and in Ontario. I have derived huge pleasure out of doing my volunteer consulting work. It has been a real gift for me in my retirement years. So let's start with the webinar, and we're going to take a look at what the purpose of the webinar is, and also a small number of learning goals that I hope by the end of the webinar we will have achieved. The purpose is to provide you and your boards with an overview how boards can improve the effectiveness of their governance and thereby create greater benefit for their organization, and that's being done by evaluating their own performance. There are 4 somewhat discrete but interrelated learning outcomes I'd like us to hopefully achieve. One is understanding the purpose of doing board self-evaluation and the benefits that can accrue from evaluating your board. I'd like us to be able to identify the range of governance functions or responsibilities that are going to be evaluated and understand how to evaluate your board's performance on these functions. And finally, to be familiar with the process of initiating and conducting such an evaluation. I don't know how many of you and your boards are at the moment or in the recent past have evaluated your performance, but so the webinar is geared to provide a fairly detailed and comprehensive overview. If you've evaluated your board before, some of this may not be relevant. I've broken the webinar down into a small number of modules. And I'm going to combine for this purpose the introduction, some introductory remarks about board self-evaluation, and the purpose, why do undertake a board self-evaluation, and the benefits. The third section is we're going to take a little look at what board self-evaluation tools and templates usually consist of. What do they encompass? How are they structured? And the fourth section is going to be a fairly in-depth look at one particular tool, a tool that was developed by McKenzie and Company for the nonprofit sector. It was developed several years ago, and it's been used by many, many, many nonprofit organizations in North America, and mostly to the satisfaction of those boards that have used it. We're going to talk a little bit about after that, about selecting and using a tool. And then finally, some sort of overarching messages about starting the journey down board self-evaluation. So we'll move right into the content then, and sort of introduce the topic. And when I was doing the research for the webinar, I came across this quote, and it really struck me as being relevant and very communicating how even more so than in previous times, board self-evaluation is important. The first thing it says is that even the best organizations, or organizations that consider themselves to be the best, need a periodic checkup to ensure that they cannot just survive, but actually thrive in today's environment. And the second piece of that quote that I think is, as I say, highly relevant, is the business about today's environment. And as you know, have had personal experience in the last year, living through the pandemic and the restrictions related to that, and the adaptations your organizations have had to make, and the economic sort of uncertainty that's out there for many nonprofits. I think that that much more complex, much more challenging and uncertain environment is another reason to have a check-in in terms of how is your board performing? Is it up to the challenge of managing through a pandemic, managing through financial, economic times that are quite constrained, and not just surviving, but thriving, as the quote says. Boards know the importance of evaluating their CEO. I hope your boards do that. It was not too long ago when that was not the norm, but that has become the norm. You're also, some boards more than others, you oversee various aspects of organizational performance. But the interesting thing is, well, a decade or so, few boards evaluated their performance. There's been much more uptake now. I wouldn't say it is the norm. I would say it's now becoming more the norm. It is not necessary to retain external resources for this initiative, for this endeavor. It's not scientific research. It's essentially using the survey methodology, and very, very accessible for boards to use. There are several comprehensive online self-evaluation tools and or templates, and I use these words interchangeably, and all of them focus on the board's key functions, or some tools call it responsibilities, and I will use those two words, functions and responsibilities, interchangeably, and evaluating these functions against practices, board governing practices that are considered to be recommended. Some use the phrase best practices, although that sometimes generates a little bit of controversy. And what the evaluation does is, by using the tool, is it provides you with qualitative data to inform a plan that you would make, having done the evaluation, that would identify areas that you would like to improve to create more effective governance. The purpose of doing it, I mean, it's good to understand at the beginning why you would want to do it, and the purpose of doing it. It really is, if you want a single sentence that would describe the purpose, it is to determine if your board is performing effectively. And in the process, you would be identifying your current strengths and also highlighting areas that you deem to be in need of improvement, or areas that are of concern to the directors as a whole. The next step of the self-evaluation is to have the results of that evaluation inform the development of an improvement plan. And finally, and importantly, to allow the different perspectives on the board to emerge. It's not always possible in the regular board meetings to hear from everybody. Nor is it possible, although perhaps more likely in board committees, for the perspectives of directors to emerge. But this self-evaluation really does provide an excellent opportunity to make sure that you're hearing from everyone in terms of how they view the functioning of the board and its effectiveness. We're going to talk now a little bit about how these tools were developed and what they encompass. As I mentioned earlier, there are several good evaluation tools for nonprofit boards, and they have emerged and been developed over the last 10 or 15 years. A lot of them have been developed by consulting companies, in response to the need of boards to find ways to determine if their governance is effective. And all these tools, I say most, but really all these tools function on what they consider to be the board's key functions or responsibilities. They may categorize and describe these functions differently, but they're all very similar in content. There is really only one way to slice and dice the work and the responsibilities of a governing body. Some also provide guidance within the tool on what would be considered best practices for each function. And this latter aspect helps directors know where they may need to improve, or where they know they want to improve. So the objectives of a board self-evaluation are twofold. Is your board performing the function? Is the first one. And if so, how well is it performing that particular function? And the best tools in the marketplace are able to answer both questions. The example I'm going to be using for purposes of this webinar is one, as I mentioned, developed by the McKenzie and Company, the nonprofit board self-assessment tool. I chose it having reviewed a number of the tools and templates, which I will refer to at the end of the webinar. I have pulled together a reference section with the links to a wide variety of sample tools. But the reason I've chosen this one to use for the webinar is that it is very comprehensive, which is not to suggest it's necessarily the best, but it is very comprehensive and allows you to see the broad scope, the most broad approach to evaluating your board's performance. It can be downloaded as a PDF. I've put the link at the bottom of the screen. There are other free tools and templates. They're in the reference section. There are also many other fee-based ones, but they're not included. This, in my own opinion, it is entirely possible, feasible for boards to take one of these tools, adapt as they feel they want to, as appropriate, and use it themselves. In fact, I think there is benefit in doing it yourself, choosing your tool, becoming familiar with it, and in the process, you will find that that is part of the learning experience. We're going to take a more in-depth look at the McKenzie tool. As I mentioned, it's very comprehensive. Don't let the comprehensiveness of the tool overwhelm you, alarm you, discourage you. As I said, it is perhaps the most comprehensive tool, only to give you a sense as to the breadth of functions, etc., that can be evaluated. There are 3 sections to this tool. The first section is the one we'll spend the most time on, and that is the 9 key responsibilities or functions that a governing body has. They've categorized them under 3 headlines, but in fact, we're going to look at each of the 9, 2 under shaping mission and strategic direction, 4 under ensuring leadership and resources, and the final section focused on monitoring and improving performance. At the highest level, it is those 3 strategic areas in which the board does its work. Section 2 of the tool is helpful. It's a 1-page survey for your board. And after the evaluation is done and you identify what the collective sense is as to which aspects of your governance needs improvement, this allows directors to identify which they think are the priorities. You may have a number of areas that you'd like to tackle, but really, realistically, I suggest that you choose a couple of the highest priority ones and focus on that in terms of for the next year or 2. And the third section, they call these variables enablers, and they're really important. And some of the tools do not canvas this area as well as the McKenzie tool does. Variables as the size of your board and its structure, the composition, the talent on your board, the leadership of the board, and also the processes that the board has developed over time. So that's an overview of the 3 sections of the McKenzie tool. And now we're going to start the more in-depth look at some of the key functional areas and give you a sense as to how this tool is structured. But most tools, most of the best tools use a structure of the self-evaluation that is quite like this. They would identify, as this slide does, the key function. In this case, it's shaping the mission and vision, which is a key function of the governing board. And then it has a rating scale. Sometimes it's a 3-point rating scale. Often it's a 5-point rating scale. This one is 4. And I have to say that the 4th scale, but the first 4th scale is labeled in a way that doesn't particularly suit me. I think that word distinctive may be, could be better replaced, could be replaced with something a little less unhumble, if I might say. So, and for each key function or responsibility, they break it down into component parts. This one has 4 components, and we'll just briefly touch upon each of them so you begin to get the feel of, again, how the tool is structured so that it produces good results. So the first subcomponent of this particular key function is a common understanding of mission. And I don't know how many boards you've been on, but I've been on many over the years, and it's not always that there is common understanding and agreement about what the mission of the organization they're governing is. And then they rate the performance all the way from poor to distinctive, and they give a description of what poor performance would be. of what average performance would be, good performance, and finally distinctive performance, or you might say excellent performance. And for example, in terms of the component of ensuring a common understanding of mission, a poor performance would be active and open disagreement about the mission. Now, I don't think that happens very, very often, but it can happen. One can imagine that it could happen. Perhaps even maybe more likely in the earlier evolution of the board and its organization. An average performance would be board members agree to share understanding of the mission. Disagreements may exist, but ways are found to resolve them. Good performance would be the board members share common understanding of the mission, although it has not been stress tested through discussion. And that stress testing simply means it's not really been reviewed and thought about in a deep way. And that usually occurs or should occur as the initial phase of a strategic planning process. And then what they described as being distinctive performance, excellent performance, is that all board members share a common understanding of the mission that has been stress tested, that has been, in other words, that has been arrived at through ample discussion. The second component, subcomponent of this key function is a common understanding of the vision. Most organizations have a vision statement, mission statement, and values. Sorry, mission, vision, and values. This second one is around common understanding of the vision. And I'm not going to go through the rating scale in terms of talking about what would be poor performance and what would be considered excellent performance. And the third component is the use of mission and vision in developing strategy and in all policy decisions. Now, I have to say that for me, this is really an important aspect of governance to pay attention to. And not all boards that I have been on have actually kept the mission and the vision at the forefront of their decision making. It's easy to become unfocused about strategy if you do not actually keep the mission and the vision firmly, as I say, at the forefront. And the fourth component, subcomponent of this is that there's a process for raising mission and vision issues. And usually, again, that occurs as part of the strategic planning process. We're now going to move on and take a look at the second key responsibility area, and that is engaging in strategic planning and policy decisions. I'm going to assume that most of your boards do undertake a strategic planning process. So I'm not going to spend much time on this, but they have broken it down into three components, two on this slide and one on the subsequent slide. The first is there is a process in place, a well-developed, thought-out, delineated process for exploring the external environment, identifying the opportunities and challenges, strengths and weaknesses, bringing that all together to inform the ultimate strategy that the board decides to take to guide the organization forward to achieve its mission and its vision. There is another component that speaks to the quality of the actual plan, and I'm not going to, we won't spend any time on that. And their third component of this is, as I say, on the next slide, and we'll get there in 1 second or two, and that is agreeing. And this is important. This is a topic that can really, really befuddle boards, frustrate boards, frustrate executive directors, and be somewhat at times difficult to resolve. And that is finding agreement on what is the board's role vis-a-vis what is the role of your chief executive. as I say, I've been on boards where it's been problematic, and it's very good when recruiting and selecting a new ED to fairly soon in their tenure as reporting to you as the board, you get this clear. So I'm not going to spend any more time on that, only to note that it is very important. The third key area of responsibility has to do with selecting, evaluating, and developing the CEO. Again, the selecting sometimes is the easiest part. I'm not saying there wouldn't be challenges, but it is actually, relatively speaking, the easiest part of selecting, evaluating, and developing. The first part of it, the first component, speaks to the need to do some succession planning. Depending on the ED you do have, discussions should be held from time to time in terms of determining how long the ED is likely to be with you. As EDs reach closer to the age of retirement, it definitely is something that really should be discussed in advance of being surprised that the ED has decided to move towards a life of more leisure. So succession planning, it isn't done all that often by boards, particularly smaller boards, but I think it's something you should give your attention to. Grooming, identifying people in the organization who could move up into that position is part of the succession planning. And the ED, your current ED, can help you identify those individuals. And you should, in the process of evaluating the CEO, you should give some attention to ascertaining in which areas does the ED wish to develop further, and in what areas you as a board would like to see the ED develop further. So that becomes part of the evaluation process. I don't think we're going to go into the search process, and those are the three subcomponents or components of that particular function. The next one you're probably more familiar with, and this is the one that boards focused on historically. It was the one they were most comfortable overseeing, which is not to say that there necessarily was a lot of board expertise, although there were usually people with financial backgrounds on most boards. But of course, they relied very heavily on the audit that was done. And the audit would be presented to the board would approve that, the audit results. And that was perhaps the extent. And I'm not talking about very recently, I'm talking about 10, 15 years ago. But now with the environment being so much more complex, with regulatory requirements having been increased, with the risks increased for every board, and certainly the pandemic has demonstrated that for many, many smaller nonprofit organizations. And so that is an area that really needs to be paid attention to. The second and third component of this one may not be relevant to you. I don't know many nonprofits that especially small to medium-sized ones, that ask for individual director donations to the organization. And neither do I know too many small or medium-sized boards that actually have responsibility for significant fundraising. So when you're choosing a tool and adapting the tool, these are two that if they're not relevant to your board, you would probably just take out. Moving on to the fifth key area of functional responsibility is the providing expertise and access for organizational needs. Now, this and the next one are ones that are not really well developed um, in the uh, in the nonprofit sector. Again, I would say particularly in smaller and medium-sized organizations, where the capacity is a bit, perhaps a bit more limited, but it can be extremely beneficial for organizations to be able to access some of the individual expertise that exists across your board members. There may be directors who had the interest in the time, uh, not just in terms of committee work, but in other sets of circumstances to be able to reach out to the organization and provide that expertise. Also, in terms of reaching out to the community, and being a spokesperson for the organization. We're going to move on to the next one now. I'll let you take a look at that. Take a look at that before you actually eliminate it. I think it's definitely worth exploring and developing some capacity to use all that board expertise in other than committee work to actually help the organization. Building reputation is the same. I'm not sure that every director and every board likes to know that their organization has a good reputation in the community. But I don't think boards have put their minds to looking at how they may help build that reputation. And there's any number of ways that a board can do that. We'll move on to the sixth key area of functional responsibility, and that is overseeing the financial performance. And I think this is somewhat duplicative of an earlier one, but no, we'll go to number 7. Yeah, exactly. So this is the oversight of the financial performance. And a big piece of that, an increasingly big piece of that, is risk assessment and risk management. And for those of you who haven't been exposed to some learning in that area, at one of the sessions in the OCASI governance series is focused entirely on risk assessment, and a Mass volunteer consultant presented that webinar and has done a great deal of research on how to identify risks, how to decide whether they're major risks, key risks, critical risks, and then subsequently how you go about mitigating that risk, managing that risk. So if you didn't attend that session, you may want to access it because it too was recorded. This next area of key responsibility is monitoring performance and ensuring accountability. And for many smaller organizations and even medium-sized ones, the capacity to actually perform this function in some fairly comprehensive way, it really has been difficult to achieve. It's partly related to funding, because it does take, it can be a bit labor intensive, but the challenge is that many funders, both government, public funders, and private funders, foundations, and private donors really are increasingly expecting the nonprofit board and organization to be able to provide evidence as to what value for money they are creating with the investment of those external resources. Some larger organizations are really getting quite skilled at doing this. there is expertise, for example, within MAS, Management Advisory Service. There are volunteer consultants who are very well versed in what that capacity, how to build that capacity within the organization. So there are, identifying performance metrics. Again, how, against what standard are you evaluating or analyzing your performance, the organizational performance, and then the process for monitoring monitoring the performance over time, and at the same time identifying areas for improvement, which is the purpose of this particular webinar with respect to board performance. We're moving fairly quickly now. We'll go on to the second to last key area of responsibility. No, that is number 9, and that is improving board performance. And that is fundamentally what this webinar is all about. So I'm not going to spend any time on it. It would be interesting to take a look at the components of how they break that function down into components and see whether or not this webinar has been able to assist in understanding how you do go about that. We're now going to take a look at this section 2 of the McKenzie tool, and we won't spend much time on it. It's a way of identifying what priorities you're going to work on in terms of improving over the upcoming period. That partly relates to when the cycle that you're going to select. Are you going to be undertaking a board self-evaluation on an annual basis, every 2 years? You have to focus on the priorities you choose. So, and as I said earlier, I recommend not identifying too many priorities to work on in the intervening months or 2 years between when you do it one time and when you decide you're going to undertake it again. The third section of the tool, we'll move on to that now. And these are the enablers. And this is a part of this tool that I really think is very helpful, just in understanding how each of these aspects, each of the four enablers actually can make a huge difference in the degree of the effectiveness of your performance of the governing functions. Things like size of the board, small, large. Do you have an executive committee? Are its terms of reference clear? Does it provide the leadership in crises and between regular board meetings? What is the committee structure? I have found in doing governance training over the years that many boards have a quite unwieldy standing committee structure. At times they don't have enough committees, and more often they have too many. And that consumes huge energy and time on both the part of board directors and also your chief executive. And then the mechanisms for affiliating with the community. Some boards have chosen to create community advisory committees, but there's all kinds of mechanisms that can be used for the board to affiliate with its key stakeholders. The second enabler is the composition of the board. What is the talent? What is the breadth and depth of experience and skills and knowledge across your directors? Importantly, before you start down the road of recruiting, do you have a process? And have you identified criteria for selecting your next director or set of directors? And what I have found helpful in this regard is to develop a board composition matrix. That is to pull together a matrix that allows you to see at a glance what expertise you have on your board and what individual directors' interests are, so that you can match them up. There are two reasons. You can match them up with committee work, and also it will tell you whether there are any gaps. And sometimes, you know, a board is a long-serving board with members with long tenure, may have been appropriate, had the appropriate breadth and depth of expertise in earlier years, but as the environment has become much more challenging, you may find that there's a gap or two. And this is a good way, having that board composition matrix is a good way to keep yourself focused on not just what would be nice to have, but what talents you really do need to have to do a good job. And then certainly the diversity issue. We needn't have gone through this past year with what's occurring in both across the border and here in Canada to know that diversity is a critical issue. And the consensus increasingly is that a board should reflect the diversity that exists in the community you serve. Not always easy to recruit for diversity, but certainly must be given attention. We'll move on now. Oh yes, so term limits. You got to keep track of those. That's sort of, I don't think that needs to be said. And then the orientation process. A lot of boards have not yet put their attention to putting together an orientation, both material and sort of in-person orientation to new directors, and yet fully expect them to start actively participating right off the bat. So the orientation is very, very important. We'll move on to the next enabler, which is the leadership. Is your chair effective? Do the executive officers as a group function well? Do they provide good, solid leadership, transparent leadership for the board? Is there a process for deciding who should become the chair, the vice chair, etc.? Again, succession planning, you can't assume. And many boards that I've found, the chair has been in the position for quite some time and is ready to have a bit of respite. And finding someone to take over amongst the directors is often a challenge. So it's good to sort of put your mind from time to time to who would be willing and able to take on some of those leadership positions. And generally speaking, the effectiveness of the leaders who play pivotal roles in how your board operates. And the final enabler is processes. Do directors get the material before regular meetings well in advance? Do they review it? Do they digest it? Do they come to the board meeting prepared to discuss? If there are motions to be considered, have they thought about those motions and become prepared to vote? Effective meeting processes, I find also in many instances that the way a board structures the agenda of its regular meetings does not necessarily facilitate effective governance. A lot of time is often spent in sharing information, but very little time spent on stepping back a bit and thinking about things at a more strategic, higher level. And that is one sort of transition from a board that's just beginning, perhaps, to govern to a board that has governed for a while, and particularly in the climate, in the environment that we're working in now, where many organizations, smaller organizations in particular, feel vulnerable. They are vulnerable, and they really need directors to be attentive, to be fully engaged, and help determine what strategy is going to provide some sustainability. And we know that some small organizations, nonprofits, will not survive, have not already survived the last year. And the funding environment is even more competitive than it may have been in the past. Also, find ways to put some fun into the board meetings. That's essential. Retreats are a good way of doing that. There are also other ways, and I'm sure your board has found ways to do that, because there has to be some fun in the volunteer contribution that you make to these organizations, and that contribution is huge. So we're now going to talk just briefly about how to select and how to use the tool, a self-evaluation tool. I would suggest that you may want to review 2 or 3 of the tools that are referenced in the final slide, and decide whether there's one that, with very little adaptation, you feel comfortable using with your board. Some will feel more appropriate than others, and that's important. You want to make sure that the language used in the tool is appropriate to your directors, and that it's not going to overwhelm directors and not intimidate them in terms of participating in the evaluation. You can adapt as needed. All these tools can be adapted. Absolutely. Delete items that don't apply. I referred to a couple of them, for example, in the McKenzie tool. No need to keep that on the evaluation if it's not relevant. You can use part of several tools to customize one for your board. That's a little more labor intensive, not impossible, but it can be done. Again, using a part of tool A and another part of tool B, etc., can be done. I would think that starting off, you might want to use a tool that is already pretty meets your needs. I wouldn't necessarily invest a lot of time and energy in customizing one from the bottom up for your board. You can change the rating scale. A 5-point rating scale seems to be a bit of a norm, but 3-point scale is also fine. Use the language that most suits your board in terms of what words you put in each of those points of the rating scale. And there are many versions of what language is possible. In terms of using the tool, using a board self-evaluation tool, I have a few suggestions to make, and we're going to cover that in our next slide. If this is the first board evaluation, I think it will reap benefits to orient directors to the purpose and benefits. And those first couple of slides in the webinar would suffice. It'll give you a chance to, persuade people in a way that the purpose is a laudable one, and that the benefits can be significant in terms of board performance. I think you also need to identify the board committee that will oversee the self-evaluation, that will choose the tool, adapt it if necessary, and then oversee the process of directors completing the survey, taking a look at the results, doing a bit of analysis, and then developing a summary report to go back to the board. And if you're using the McKenzie tool, that summary report can also include the priorities the directors have collectively decided are worth pursuing. You also need to decide how often you're going to undertake the evaluation, again, annually or biannually. And it's always good to assure, and this would be part of your orientation, assure the directors that all responses are anonymous. You will not be quoting Director A as having said something that might be considered a little inappropriate. And the results that you put in your summary report will be reported in aggregate. You're not going to be zeroing in on any individual director in terms of the input they've had. So that's an important thing to do, because when people are doing surveys, if you really want to try to obtain honest feedback, honest opinions, you got to make sure that people understand that they're not going to be centered out when the summary report comes to the board. One of the final slides is on, it's a graphic that I think is, oh, sorry, there is another, my apologies. Yes, so you select the time frame for when you're going to undertake it, send it to directors, give them a certain amount of time. I wouldn't suggest too much time to complete it. Consolidate the results, present the results to the board, again, identify the priorities, and develop an improvement plan to address the areas where you think you need to improve. You need to assign the monitoring of the plan, of the implementation of the improvement plan to the board committee. I think keeping it with the same committee that you used to oversee the conduct of the evaluation might not be a bad idea. And then you have to really make room from time to time on your monthly board agendas for the discussion of how you're doing on the one or two priorities that you've decided to focus on in terms of improving your board performance. The next graphic, you I'm sure are familiar with the continuous improvement, quality improvement that many nonprofit organizations have been working on for a number of years. Well, we can view this board self-evaluation process as the board's continuous improvement cycle. So you evaluate your performance, you plan the improvements, identify the improvements that you want to make, you implement those improvements, and then before you undertake the next evaluation, you review whether or not the activities you've undertaken to address the priority areas for improvement have actually resulted in positive outcomes. And so that's this continuous improvement cycle. And I think a board self-evaluation tool is really an excellent instrument to use to keep track of how you are continuously improving the performance of your governance function. Finally, just a few sort of maybe key messages to finish the webinar off. It is an important responsibility, as the outline of the 9 key functions indicated. It is an important responsibility for the board to step back and look at its own performance. This occurs under the leadership of the chair, but each and every director is responsible for participating actively in the process and giving it some serious thought. It does create added value for directors. It makes them feel more confident. It brings people together. It makes for a more cohesive board, and it also adds value to your organization. It's not onerous, and as we pointed out, there are many free online tools available. Easy to adapt these tools. In fact, very easy. Start small. That's important. Start small. Start with a tool that seems manageable for you. And I'll point out one tool in the reference section that you may want to take a closer look at in terms of it being more simple, not quite as comprehensive, still a very good start. then select, when you've looked at your results, select the small number, very small number of priority areas, monitor the progress, and then continue the cycle of improving your board's governance. Let me just say a word or two about the references. I have provided links for all of them. They're all available in the form of a PDF. I've included the two accreditation bodies. I don't know whether your organizations are accredited, but each of Accreditation Canada and Imagine Canada have developed standards for governance performance as part of the accreditations that they do for organizations. It used to be that boards really weren't focused on by accreditors when they come to do the survey, the accreditation visit. But increasingly, the accreditation standards for governing bodies has evolved over time. The rest of these are discrete tools and templates. The one that I was referring to, I'm just going to take off my glasses for a moment. The one that, let's see, yes, the third bullet down, Board Effectiveness and Performance Questionnaire by a consultant out in the West Coast by the name of Robert Cook is probably one of the more accessible tools. Again, not as comprehensive as McKenzie, but could be for you a good tool to start with. So that finishes the webinar. I want to thank you very much for attending. It's been a pleasure to work with you. I want to also remind you of two things. One is that the volunteer consultants at Mass are eager to help if they can. We've provided the contact information for Mass, and don't hesitate to email, to call and chat with someone about maybe a project that you'd like to have some help with. The second thing is to remind you, and I think Tarana will be doing this, that the learning exchange will take place this coming Monday at 1 o'clock. So I look forward to seeing you then and chatting more about the journey of board self-evaluation. Thanks very much.